Amen. Down towards the end of chapter 13, verses 31 and 32, the men who brought the report back after spying the land, we read that they go to Moses. The men that went up with him said, "We are not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we." And they brought up an evil report of the land, which they had searched unto the children of Israel, saying, "The land, though we have gone to search it, is a land that eateth up the inhabitants thereof. And all the people that we saw in it are men of great stature." Read the story of a man and his daughter on one of these cruises, these week-long or 10-day-long cruises, and came to that part of the cruise where just all in front of them was just the open sea, the open ocean, and you could see for quite literally for miles ahead. And the little girl put it like this to her dad. She said this, "Daddy, I can look even further than my eyes can actually see. I can look even further than my eyes can actually see." But folks, if we're honest with ourselves spiritually, is that not the vision that we all need in these days? We need to look beyond what our eyes can naturally and actually see. We need to look beyond the difficulties and the problems and the obstacles that we find. And of course, the great obstacle is the great multitude of sin before us. You think, for example, if you're going to witness to someone, you're going to invite them to the mission next week, what do you see? Well, you see the natural man. He's in his sin. And the Bible tells us in Romans 3 that no man seeketh after the Lord. So right away we are confronted with a problem. And yet we need eyes to see beyond the problem, don't we? We need eyes to see beyond what is actually in front of us. We need eyes to see what God would see about his kingdom. That God is able to work and God has promised to build his church. Of course, the well-known verse in light of this really is Proverbs 29, verse 18. "Where there is no vision, the people perish." And I'm sure you've heard that verse quoted in terms of evangelism and soul winning. Where you think of no vision for people and lost people, then the people perish in their sin. But that's not really what that verse means. It's really speaking about unto God's people. And that verse really means where there is no vision of God, the Lord's people perish or they are destroyed. They are, and you read on through the verses and before it and after it, you'll see that very, very quickly. That it's about people having a vision of God. And if we don't have the right vision of God, if we don't look beyond what these natural eyes can see and walk by faith and not by sight, then we as a people, we will be extinguished. We will ultimately die out and we will be destroyed. Now the doctors would tell us that the mind, the part of the mind that plays the greatest role in achieving goals or attaining goals, is the part that visualizes something. So you may not realize it, but whilst we have one brain, there are two parts to the brain, obviously the left and the right side. The left side of the brain is concerned with logic and speech, and the right side of the brain is given over to imagination, intuition, and creativity. And you actually find that it's a bit of a problem of society, that for decades, yea, for centuries, we have been trained to further develop or train the left side of the brain, which is concerned with logic and speech. That's really the basis of much of education today. And very little time is given over to the right side of the brain, the imagination, the intuition, the creative side of the brain. Someone has rightly said that the greatest tragedy in life is to have sight, but no vision. I wonder, could that be said of you today, that you have, well, maybe not perfect sight like myself, but certainly decent sight. You have sight, but you have no real vision. No real vision for the Lord. No real vision for what he could do. In fact, what he promises to do if we launch out in faith and we believe him and take him at his word. That is what we find the vast majority of people possessed here in Numbers 13. They had great sight. They could retrace to Moses whenever they returned from this report. They could tell him all about the the wonderful figs and the grapes and the honey and the milk. They could tell him all about the sons of Anak there, the giants that were there. They could tell him about how small they felt, because they said in these last verses, we were as grasshoppers before them. They had great sight. They could tell Moses all about the land, but they had no real vision. No real vision of the fact that God had promised them the very land where the giants were dwelling. Numbers 12:16 tells us the last verse that they left Hazeroth and they pitched in the wilderness of Paran. So they're in the wilderness. They eventually have left Sinai, where we have been with them over these last few weeks. They are in the wilderness, and the wilderness of Paran was right on the cusp, right on the edge of the promised land. And Moses gathers together these men that are mentioned, their name here from verse 4 to verse 16, these heads of tribes, and he sends them to spy out the land. And they spy out the land, and they do a great job of spying out the land. You read of them here in the places that they went to. We've read of it. Verse 21, the wilderness of Zin. They ascended the south. All of these different areas. Verse 23, the brook of Eshcol. They go through the land, north, south, east, west. They get a great look at the land. Nothing wrong with their sight. But sadly, plenty wrong with their vision. Because you know what the result of all this was? That as a result of them giving this bad report, this faithless report, that the land is too great and we can't possess it, the people of God, in believing this report, spent 39 more years wandering through the wilderness, when all the while they were on the cusp of Canaan. Literally, they were on the very brink of Canaan. Remember, they've only out of the wilderness, really, or only out of Egypt, a year. Well, maybe just more than a year, maybe 14, 15 months, as we find them here in Numbers 13. And so for 39 more years, as a result of not believing this, these faithful men, Caleb and Joshua, that we're going to look at, they went through the wilderness. Oh, child of God, how dangerous it is that we have eyes to see, but sadly no vision. Because we can just go through our lives just like the people of God as they went through the wilderness, when all the while God wants us to enter into all that he has laid up for us and promised us in his word. Possessing our land, as it were, possessing our Canaan, seeing individuals, seeing the great giants topple as he has promised he would do. Eyes to see, but no vision. That's what we have here in Numbers 13 and 14. And I want to look at that for a few moments this morning. Think with me firstly about the men that were sent. The men that were sent. Who were these men? Verse 1 of chapter 13 tells us, the Lord spake to Moses, saying, Send thou men that they search the land which I give the children of Israel. Of every tribe of their father shall ye send a man, every one a ruler among them. Excuse me. So we're introduced to these men. As I said, they're named there. They were the heads of the tribes. Every tribe, you see it there, of the tribe of Benjamin, verse 9, of the tribe of Zebulun, verse 10, tribe of Joseph, verse 11. So these were heads of tribes that were sent to spy out the land. Sometimes we lose that, don't we? These were great men. These were men who had proved themselves. These were men who were literally in charge of hundreds of thousands of people. Tried men, trusted men, men that Moses has proved and men that Moses is happy with as they have been over each tribe. And yet, verse 3, Moses, by the commandment of the Lord, sent them from the wilderness. All those men, notice it, that were heads of the children of Israel. It would be a bit like if you're going to war. Well, you pick something like the SAS or some specialist service or something like that. You pick the cream of the crop in terms of your soldiers. These men were the cream of the crop in terms of Israel. Verse 18, Moses sent them, why? To see the land, what it is, and the people that dwell therein, whether they be strong, weak, few, many, and what the land is that they dwell in, whether it be good or bad. Now notice it, verse 18. They were sent with a very simple but very specific task. to spy out the land in terms of the terrain, and to spy out the people of the land. That's really all they were sent to do. Find out what the land is like, and find out who's in the land. Who have we got to conquer? Notice what they weren't sent to do. They were not sent to debate the issue when they came back. They were simply sent to rehearse what they had seen, what they had observed. To put it very simply, folks, they were not sent to work out whether they should take the land or not. They were sent to find out how they should go about taking the land. So the issue of whether they should take the land or not is not really up for grabs, because God has promised it. They're just sent to find out more about the land, really. And whenever they get there, boys, what do they see? They witness the like of which they have never seen. Verse 23 mentions these big clusters of grapes. It was time for the grapes to be ripened. It says that there. It speaks, verse 23, of the pomegranates, of the figs. And you even read in these verses of them bringing a lovely cluster of grapes and things back to actually show them what the land was like. So they see the land, but they also see what the people of the land are like. Verse 28. The people be strong that dwell in the land, and the cities are walled very great. Moreover, we saw the children of Anak there. The children of Anak were giants. I mean, literally giant men. Verse 32, the land through which we have gone to search it is a land that eateth up the inhabitants thereof, and all the people we saw in it are men of great stature. So now you begin to see here that yes, they present the grapes, they present the figs, they present the pomegranates, and it's all lovely, but you begin to see even in this report here the kind of pessimistic spirit. The cities, they're great cities, but there's massive walls around these cities. The men there, they're great men. They're literally giants. And even though the land was beautiful and the land was promised, you see it again, verse 32, a land that eateth up the inhabitants thereof. You try to get through this land, it's going to eat you up, it's going to swallow you up. It's going to be very hard for us to get through this land, even though they've been in the wilderness for over a year. And verse 33, well, we see where they really are. There we saw the giants, the sons of Anak, which come of the giants. And we were in our own sight as grasshoppers, and so we were in their sight. So we see this, but there's just so many difficulties that come along with possessing the land. You see, they had perfect sight. And as I have shown you, they have great sight. They could observe many things, and they did, and they reported this back. They had great sight, but no vision. No vision. I wonder, is this how you see today? You see and you look around in terms of our land, you look at the work of God, you look at the Church of Jesus Christ, and undoubtedly you know what God has promised. You know that God will cause his people to flourish. You know promises like Isaiah chapter 11, where it speaks of the whole earth being full of the knowledge of the Lord. Habakkuk as well. You know that God has promised he will build his church. As we have looked at these promises that were made to Moses, that I will give you a people as numerous as the grains of sand in the seashore, and as numerous as the stars in the sky. You know this, but really, if you're honest with yourself, your perspective is just like that of the people here. Verse 33, we're in our own sight as grasshoppers, and there be giants in the land. Maybe this week you've felt, well, I'll go and speak to someone and I'll make them this mission known to them. But you've went to them, you've went to their door, you've family member, whatever it might be, and you've just felt like a wee grasshopper, haven't you? And all you see is this giant, this son of Anak, as it were. Just a massive giant, just a massive obstacle. And you see the obstacle. You see the giant in front of you. And you don't see beyond the giant to what God has promised. You even think of how God has promised us to, as we would do his bidding, as we would do his work. Romans chapter 8, that great chapter of victory. Verse 37, we can be more than conquerors through him that loved us. Philippians 4 verse 13 tells us that you can do all things through Christ, which strengtheneth you, which gives you strength, literally, which continues to strengthen you. And yet all the while, we're just like verse 31. We're not able to go up against the people, for they're stronger than we. Is that where you are today, child of God? Just put simply, very simply, they're stronger than we. You look at the enemy. It's easy to think that the enemy are stronger than we. But they are not. But yet circumstances and circumstantially, we feel like that, don't we? We feel like they're getting the upper hand, that it's too difficult, the obstacles are too great, too many to overcome, and therefore we don't go at all. School teacher once asked her class to define a donkey. The wee boy raised his hand and said, a donkey is an animal that's awfully backward about going forward. And so often is that not like us in the work of God? We're awfully backward about going forward. Going forward. And that takes us to the second thought. Because we've thought about the men that were sent, but what about the minority that could see? You see, there were 12 men that were sent to spy out the land of the 12 heads of the tribes of Israel, but really only 2 could see. 2 had a vision. Chapter 13, verse 30, we read of one of them. Caleb stilled the people before Moses and said, let us go up at once and possess it, for we're well able to overcome it. So from verse 25 on into chapter 14, we have the report of these 12 spies. As we've seen, the spirit of the vast majority of them, well, the giants are big and we're small. We're just like grasshoppers. Now, I want you to see here that Caleb is mentioned. Joshua is also the other man who is full of faith, as we'll get to, but Caleb is only mentioned in chapter 13. It's not until chapter 14 where Joshua is mentioned. Various reasons for that. Perhaps Caleb was older. Perhaps he was just much bolder. Perhaps he just had more to say. We don't really know. But the fact is that they still had a respect for Caleb. Because look again at verse 30 closely. Caleb stilled the people before Moses. Now when you read verse 25 to 29, you'll see that these men, they're just unburdening on Moses. And they're giving this report of the great giants and etc. This pessimistic report. But in the middle of their report, Caleb, it says, he stilled the people. So he scanned them. And in the midst of their reporting, not in a rude way, I don't believe, but he had the respect and the esteem of these men to still them, to calm them. And I love his spirit, verse 31, or verse 30. Let us go up at once and possess it. Now notice it. For we are well able to overcome it. All the while, these other 10, they're saying, no, land too difficult to get through. Yeah, there's rewards for inheriting the land. The land's beautiful. Milk, the honey, the grapes, the pomegranates. But it's not worth really because the terrain's too difficult. And there are giants there. If we even make it to these walled cities, we still have to get through the walls and we still have to topple these giants. But in the middle of it, what does Caleb say? At once, let us go and possess it. He's essentially saying, right now, let us go right now at once. The time has arrived. We need to go. Yes, there are giants, but there are also wonderful rewards on offer for us. You see again verse 30? We are well able to overcome it. Everything in this land. The land itself, these giants, these walled cities, these fenced cities, we are well able to overcome it. Well able. Do you know what you see in Caleb and then eventually in Joshua? You see that it's one thing to exist in a time of apathy. It's another thing to be affected by the spirit of apathy. To imbibe the spirit of apathy of the day is quite another thing. And so whenever you And look, we all meet that spirit of apathy, but we have a choice. You have a choice, my friend. When you meet apathy, or an apathetic or lethargic kind of a spirit, are you going to be affected by the spirit of apathy, or are you not? You know, the Bible's full of examples of people who lived in a day of apathy but were not affected by the apathy that surrounded them. Take the Apostle Paul. I mean, you think about it. Everywhere Paul went, he was criticized, he was stoned, he was thrown out of cities. Times he had to get out of cities for fear of his own life. He was imprisoned, he was in the deep. And yet what did he do? He just kept going. He went to very immoral cities like Corinth. He went to very intellectual cities after, like Athens. Yes, he had great times in Berea, but that was only after he left Thessalonica, where he literally had to leave and escape in Acts 17 because of his life. You read of him in Acts 14 in Lystra being nearly stoned to death. And yet when you read Scripture, do you know what you'll find? He was back in Lystra on 2 other occasions at least that I can see. He just kept going. He was not affected by the spirit of apathy. As he said to the church in Corinth, sorrowful yet always rejoicing. He did not let the spirit of apathy, the opposition, the ungodliness of man affect him, go from city to city, and see a work done for Jesus Christ. Again, you think of the coming of the Messiah in terms of his first coming. Undoubtedly, there were many Jews who had lost heart. They had been praying literally for centuries, that the Messiah would come, that there would be all of the fulfillment of the promises. And yet in Luke chapter 2, what do you find? You find a just and devout old man named Simeon. And what was he doing? He was in the house of God. And he was waiting for the consolation of Israel. He was waiting. In his old age, he was waiting. He was praying for the fulfillment of the promise, for the Messiah to come. Anna as well. In Luke chapter 2, you read of her. She spent literally decades waiting on God, serving God night and day with fastings and prayers. What was she doing? She was waiting in the same thing that her friend Simeon was waiting on. The birth of the Messiah. And all that would mean, the consolation of Israel. Now, let's come back to Numbers. We must ask ourselves the question, why were Caleb and Joshua clothed and clad with the spirit that they were? How was it then, and how is it that you and I don't have to be affected by a spirit of apathy that you and I meet? Well, we find in chapter 14 the reasons. You see, these men, they knew God's plan. Look at chapter 14, verse 8. If the Lord delights in us, he will bring us into this land and give it us. Still in this debate amongst all of the reporting of what they saw. He recognized, and Joshua as well, recognized it was God's plan to bring them into the land. And nothing, even the waywardness of man, is not going to thwart that plan. And so he sees the plan. Yes, the giants are there and the difficult land is there. But he sees the plan and he knows this is God's design for us. Do you think about it, child of God? What is God's design for his church? What is God's design for your life? It's that you may. John 15, why did he choose us? You have not chosen me, but I have chosen you and ordained you that you should go forth and bring forth fruit. That you might live a godly life in this ungodly world. And part of that is that you might bring others to Jesus, as we looked at on Tuesday. As Andrew brought old rough and tough Simon Peter, his brother, to Jesus. Part of God's design and desire for your life, part of his plan for your life, is that you would be fruitful. That you would see others, like Jacob as he had that reunion with Esau. These are the children which God has given me. You'll be able to go to glory and bring others with you, having won them to Jesus Christ. God's plan. Look at verse 9 of chapter 14. Caleb and Joshua's eyes were in God's power. Chapter 14, verse 9. Rebel ye not against the Lord, neither fear ye the people of the land, for they are bread for us. Their defense is departed from them, and the Lord is with us, fear them not. See old Caleb here. probably 40, 41 at this stage. See what he describes these giants. You would nearly not believe it if you didn't read it. They're bread for us. See these giants here in front of us? They are my meat and drink. They are my bread. Now let me ask you, child of God, today. Do you genuinely see the giants of this land as your meat and drink? That's what it looks like to have eyes to see, but to have vision as well. You look at this week, child of God, as we go to knock a door or two, as you go to invite family and friends to the mission starting next Sunday afternoon, how do you view those individuals? You see what Caleb saw, what God promised here. The Lord is with us, fear them not. You do not need to fear, because God has promised. Look, if it's his plan to save people, how does he do it? He does it through weak vessels like you and I. And so what does he do with the weak vessel? He gives the weak vessel strength. He gives the weak vessel power. And yes, these people, the people of God here, yes, they saw themselves, the last verse of chapter 13, they saw themselves as grasshoppers. They know their frailty. But God is promising here that I can breathe life into you, you little grasshopper, to go and fight the giant. Surely if he could do it with David, just a young lad, to literally fight a giant, and he could do it with these grasshoppers as well. You know, it was God's plan for them to take the land, and he promised power. But look again at chapter 13, verse 2. It was God's promise. It's a step further, it's stronger. Notice how it's worded, that they may search the land which I, look at it, give unto the children of Israel. In God's mind, eternal mind, he's already given the land to the people. Notice how it reads, which I give to the people. In God's mind, the people are going to be there. He's already given it. Now he expects faith in the people. He expects faith in their part. He expects them to ask God for help. But it's as if he's already given it. It's as if he's saying the words of Psalm 27, verse 1, the Lord is my light and my salvation, Caleb. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the strength of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? The Lord's your light. The Lord's your salvation, child of God. Part of that means that he's your strength as well. He's your strength. And so you should respond with the spirit of Caleb and with the spirit of the psalmist here. Of whom shall I be afraid? You remember this week as you go to people with fear and trepidation. That you don't just go to them with sight, but you go to them with vision. And you not only see what they are, but you see what God can make them. What God can make them. That's really what I looked at on Tuesday in the prayer meeting. Just to go back to it. Andrew, because it ties in. Andrew looked at his brother, old rough and tough Simon Peter. And we know what Peter was like. What a character he was to be to witness to. And yes, it was Simon, it was his own brother. Nobody knew Andrew like Simon Peter. But Andrew saw in Simon Peter not what he was, but what God could make him. And what did Jesus do in John chapter 1 verse 42? Simon, you're no longer called Simon, but Cephas. I'm going to make a stone out of you, Simon Peter. Jesus looked at Simon Peter and saw what he could make Simon Peter. Look at the giants and look beyond the giants and see that God can topple the giant with a grasshopper, infused by his strength. Story of 3 workmen who had hammers and chisels cutting away at a building. A man walked by and asked these 3 workmen, what are you doing? One responded like this, I'm just chipping away at this bit of stone. The second said, I'm trying to earn a living for my wife and children. The third man responded like this, I'm building a beautiful new building. What are you going to be doing this week, child of God? How would you respond? Part of God's building. Part of seeing individuals brought into his kingdom. The men that were sent, the minority that could see, but sadly, lastly and very quickly, the misery they all suffered. In chapter 14, there's a build-up where we see this misery. Look at their disbelief. Chapter 14, verse 22. All those men which have seen my glory, this is God speaking to Moses now, my miracles which I did in Egypt in the wilderness, they have tempted me now these 10 times and have not hearkened. God looks down from heaven, and you know what he says concerning this people? I have done so much for them. Remember this, in the guts of a year, 15 months, parted the Red Sea, fed them with manna, the smitten rock, the wonders at Sinai. What a year it's been in the experience of the people of God. God has done wonderful things. And yet now, God looks down, and what does he see? He sees in them still, in spite of all he's done, a heart of disbelief. And you know, this disbelief led to disappointment. Chapter 14, the next verse, verse 23. Surely they shall not see the land which I swear to their fathers, neither shall any of them that provoked me see it. This disbelief has led to them being disappointed. They're not going to see the land. That's what God from heaven says. They're going to be disappointed. They're going to be frustrated. And you're shown here, child of God, that sometimes this can be the source of your disappointment. In God's work, in seeing people won to Christ, not all the time, because ultimately it's God that saves, and you and I know that. But sometimes through disbelief, we are the results then of our own disappointment. You know, sometimes campaigns happen, gospel missions, work with children, special events, special meetings. People come away from the week disappointed. Ask yourself, I trust that won't happen. I pray to God that will not happen. But has it happened in God's work in the past? Yes. And unfortunately, will it happen? I'm talking generally here. In God's work in the future, it will. We must analyze the reason why it could happen. And part of the reason as to why it could happen is disbelief in the heart of God's people. That you and I do not really believe what God can do. And that's what happened here. It's a little bit like the fellow that said to his wife, why do you call it shopping when you never buy anything? And the wife said straight back to the husband, why do you call it fishing? You never catch anything. And so often we can feel like that, can't we? We never catch anything. And sometimes we're disappointed. And sometimes the reason is because of our own unbelief, disbelief. This disbelief led to disappointment, and this disappointment led to defeat. Look at the end of the chapter, chapter 14, verse 41. Moses, he speaks here about them transgressing the commandment of the Lord, it shall not prosper. Go not up, the Lord is not among you, that ye be not smitten before your enemies. For the Amalekites, the Canaanites are there before you. You shall fall by the sword, because you're turned away from the Lord. Even in this chapter, as they are on the brink of Canaan, and they decide not to go in this very chapter, you read in their experience of the Amalekites coming and destroying some of them, defeating them in battle. You read of Moses not going out of the camp. There's no ark with them now. And what you learn, really, the sad tale, and I haven't time to go through all of these verses, but the sad tale of Numbers 13 and 14 is this, is that when you live in defeatist attitude, you will experience disappointments, and then ultimately you will experience a kind of a defeated-like Christianity. That is why people have that kind of a defeatist spirit in God's work. Because you live in disbelief, that leads you to disappointment, and the disappointment leads to defeat. I trust you'll not live like that, child of God, because that's not the way God desires and designs that you live your life. Now, just to wrap all of this up, let me fast forward 40 years, very quickly. And of course, Joshua, they eventually go then. The vast majority of this people don't see the land, but Caleb and Joshua, they go, and they inherit the land, don't they? And then it comes to chapter 14. And Joshua, some of the land, much of the land is conquered, but not all of the land. Joshua begins, under the help and inspiration and direction of God, to divide up the land. And before he divides Manasseh, their inheritance, and Zebulun and Naphtali and Asher, their particular territory, their allotted territory, he comes to old Caleb. Now, Caleb was 40 as we find him in Numbers chapter 13 and 14. Caleb is 85 years old when you find him in Joshua 14. Now, you would think to yourself, and remember, he's got the choice of the land. Maybe he'll choose Jerusalem. Maybe he'll choose the lovely and lush ground somewhere in Canaan. Joshua, under the inspiration of God, gives old Caleb the choice of where he wants to go in the land. Now, listen to this. Joshua 14, verse 12, he asks for Hebron. And you will find as you read Numbers 13 and 14 that Hebron was a citadel for giants, and they were still there in Joshua. And at 85 he utters those immortal words, speaking about Hebron, "Give me this mountain." Joshua 14, verse 12, "Why, if so be the Lord will be with me, then I shall be able to drive them out." At 85 years of age, given the choice of an easy life, given the choice of a land where there were no giants and much of it had been conquered, he says, "Give me the mountain where the giants are," at 85. Why? If so be, the Lord will help me drive them out. You see that the promise hadn't changed, and Caleb's understanding hadn't changed. And just think about it. Spending 39 years of his life going through the wilderness, and yet not one iota of discouragement. His eye, you see, he could see throughout the wilderness, but oh, he had vision, didn't he? Even at the twilight years of his life. I'll finish with this. You think of John Knox, that converted firebrand, preaching the truths of Scripture. Sadly, John Knox was imprisoned in Scotland, and when he got out, he ran to England, and when he was in England, he was imprisoned by Mary Tudor. Eventually he was removed from prison. He was released from prison, and he went on the run to Europe. And in the twilight years of his life, he desired to go back to Scotland and bring them the gospel. And whenever he landed on the seashore in Scotland, you know what he did? He got down on the seashore of Scotland, down on his knees, and he looked up to heaven and said this: "Lord, give me Scotland, lest I die. Give me Scotland." Eyes to see, but he had vision. And I trust that this week, and these next few weeks especially, we'll have eyes to see, but we will have vision as well.